First, a brief commercial. As they said, I'm president of the Friends of Sabine Pass Battleground. Also have a lot of activity with the Galveston Historical Foundation, and I want to urge you folks to take advantage of the 150th anniversary next year of the things that are going on in those two places. On the weekend of January the 11th and 12th, Galveston Historical Foundation is sponsoring an incredible weekend of stuff in Galveston. Lots of speakers, a reenactment. I'll be giving walking tours of the battlefield, aerial tours, and even a Segway tour. So if you've never been on a Civil War Segway tour, this may be your chance. And the reenactment at the Sabine Pass Battleground looks like it's even going to be more impressive in terms of size. It's really going to be big this year, and we're talking to some folks that may bring down literally hundreds, possibly as many as 1,000 reenactors at the Sabine Pass Battleground. That's a small battleground. We're going to have to expand it if that really materializes. But go ahead and make your plans, because I think both of these events are going to be really, really well worth attending. January 11th and 12th on the Galveston thing, and the Sabine Pass thing, I can't remember the exact weekend, but it's the first weekend after September 8th. What? 7th and 8th. 7th and 8th. Okay, so it'll be literally the anniversary weekend, which is going to be really, really neat. Okay, talking about Galveston, we first have to kind of change our mindset regarding Galveston. Most of us think of it as kind of a sleepy little tourist town today, but that's far from what it was in 1861. In 1861, Galveston was becoming the largest city in Texas. It was maybe second to San Antonio, maybe first. It just depends on how you count the numbers, but it was certainly the most prominent city in Texas as the Civil War era came. You're looking at a photograph from 1861. The 1861 photographs of Galveston are the oldest we have of the island city. They're some of the oldest we have in the state. We're really lucky they were taken. But when you look at Galveston, you're looking at a real boom town. 2/3 of the cotton coming out of the state of Texas was coming through the port of Galveston, and trade through Galveston was growing at the remarkable rate of 50% per year. So we are really talking about an expanding area. And as Don said, the Galveston was such an important port that the Union really figured out pretty quickly they needed to do something to blockade Galveston, and that was the first port that was blockaded. This is another photograph looking south from the Strand area and looking toward the Gulf of Mexico. And I just show you this to show you can see some of the buildings don't quite have roofs on them yet. They're in the process of being constructed. And just because I like to give tours down there, a couple of landmarks in the distance, St. Mary's and Trinity are both churches that are still around today. Trinity Episcopal, 1857, and St. Mary's Cathedral, the oldest church building remaining in Galveston from 1847. Both of those churches show the scars of battle on them, and the Confederate artillery, when it pulled back, was located behind these two churches. Well, how do we happen to have a battle in Galveston anyway? As Mr. Frazier told us, in 1862, the Union really started turning their attention to Texas and started a concerted campaign to capture the various Confederate ports. That took the form of a naval invasion in the case of Galveston. And here on October 4th, 1862, a federal fleet entered Galveston Harbor. And we're very lucky that one of the doctors on board one of these ships was a very talented artist, and he recorded the entry of the federal fleet into Galveston in this famous drawing. Now, it was not opposed by the Confederacy. The general in charge of Texas, Confederate General Paul Octave Hebert, had looked at the map of Galveston and decided there was just no way it could be successfully defended. So he elected basically to give it up without firing more than one token shot. And the Confederate Army retreated to the mainland, very near where the causeway leads today, and left the island city to Union forces. They marched over to the Custom House and took possession of Galveston. And the Custom House still stands today at the corner of 20th and Post Office in Galveston. Well, it looked like Galveston, like all the major Union ports, Confederate ports before it, had been captured by the Union and was going to stay in Union hands. But that was not going to happen in the case of Galveston. This is Commodore William B. Renshaw, who was in charge of the federal fleet that entered Galveston. Again, we're talking in terms of the Navy. There were no Union land troops yet. They had not yet arrived. When they finally did arrive on Christmas Eve of 1862, instead of the thousands of men that were expected, it was only 260 men from the 42nd Massachusetts Regiment, 3 companies of men. Under the command of this group of officers, and particularly the man who's labeled there in the middle, Colonel Isaac Burrell. Now, Colonel Burrell knew that with just 260 men, he really couldn't do much to occupy the city of Galveston. So he came upon a pretty unconventional strategy of developing a place for the garrison to stay. What he did was this. There was a large wharf at the foot of 18th Street. It was called Kuhn's Wharf, K-U-H-N. And so Colonel Burrell put his men at the end of that wharf. And what they did was they went over to the wharf and they took up all the planks but one plank here near the shore. And they turned those planks sideways to make a barricade. And then they took some other planks and wood down here and made a barricade at the end of the wharf. That way, they figured, there's no way that the Confederates could launch a charge at them because all those men would have to tiptoe down on that one plank to get to them. So that's where they were at the end of the year, a week later, when the Battle of Galveston is about ready to happen. And we're really lucky somebody did take a photograph of Kuhn's Wharf, and that is the photograph from 1861 of the wharf. Now, what changed to make the Confederates who had abandoned Galveston want to take it back? Well, what happened was the general in charge of Texas changed. And arriving in Texas was Major General John Bankhead McGruder, known as Prince John to his companions in the old army. And Prince John was probably the most unconventional general of the entire Civil War and possibly in all of American military history. Nothing the man did was conventional, down to his uniform. He always wore very fancy gold braid. Sometimes he wore an ostrich plume in his hat. He had a very affected lisp, very theatrical mannerisms, but the man knew how to fight. He had been in the war with Mexico and had a reputation as a very solid fighting general. And he arrived in Texas having looked at the map, and he decided that not only could Galveston be defended, but that it was absolutely imperative that the Confederates recapture Galveston as soon as possible. But that was going to take more than good wishes, and he needed a plan. And the plan he decided upon, with the help of some local men, was that he was going to launch a combined land and sea assault at night to try and recapture Galveston. Undoubtedly one of the most wildest plans of the entire Civil War. Now, when General McGruder arrived in Houston in November of 1862, he had not one man under his command. He had no naval force whatsoever. He had no army. He had no militia troops, no army troops at all directly under his command. He had to assemble this force. The idea was that he was going to try to take a force of artillery pieces to the waterfront one night and engage the Federal fleet. And then while they were engaged, he was going to come at the Federal fleet from the rear with some gunboats. But the gunboats he was going to have to make himself. Now, McGruder himself had no experience whatsoever with naval vessels, but he encountered in Houston an old friend of his, Leon Smith. And Leon Smith elected that he would take on the whole job of developing a naval force and commanding that force in the battle that was about to happen. And so Leon Smith, who had not one rank of any kind in the Confederate military, started wearing the uniform you see on him now, and he assumed the courtesy title of Major, or depending on the occasion, Commodore. And Commodore Leon Smith was going to be in charge of the Confederate naval vessels that were going to be in charge of part of this invasion. Now, they didn't have any real gunboats, but what they did have in surplus was some very large steamers that had been used to transfer cotton from Houston and Galveston and the ports in between all along the Texas coast. And here's an example of some of those in 1861 and what they would have looked like. What Leon Smith did was that he took some steamboats and he put cotton bales all up and down the sides of these vessels, and he converted them into cotton clads. And you can see the CSS Bayou City and the CSS Neptune are the result of this experiment. So we now have cotton-clad gunboats. The thing we don't have is sharpshooters. So General McGruder looked around and he tried to find some men to go on board these cotton-clad vessels and to be the sharpshooters on board. And up near Hempstead, he found some men, the Sibley Brigade, that were in the process of regrouping before going on to Louisiana. And General McGruder asked Colonel Tom Green, who was in charge of this group, whether he would volunteer his men for this occasion, and Greene said that he would. So at Harrisburg, they decided to pick 300 men, 150 each, to go on these 2 cotton-clad gunboats. And Colonel Greene drew the men up and asked for volunteers. And the way he asked it was, he said, "Men, I've never deceived you, and I will not deceive you now. I regard this as the most dangerous enterprise that men have ever engaged in. I will go, but I do not know that I will ever return." And he looked them in the eye and he called for everybody who volunteered to step forward. But he said, "Before you step forward, I do not want any man to volunteer who's not prepared to die for his country and die now." Now that doesn't sound like much of a motivational speech today, but surprisingly, every single man in the regiment stepped forward to volunteer, and some men stepped forward 2 steps hoping they'd get an advantage in the process. And so they had to actually handpick the men that would go on board these 2 cotton-clads. What's interesting about that to me is that a lot of the men that were being asked to volunteer were from dismounted cavalry regiments. They had not seen a horse in a long time, but they certainly had never seen a ship. In fact, some of these men were Germans from the hill country area, and they had probably never even seen a ship, let alone been on one, and they will go down in history as the Horse Marines because they're volunteering part in this service. So all right, the Confederates are going to attack the Union at night with this land and sea force, and General McGruder's got a whole bunch of artillery pieces to be part of the land portion of this attack. And on December the 31st of 1862, on New Year's Eve, they're going to launch this plan. For 2 reasons. First, the tides are particularly good that evening for somebody sweeping down toward the Federal fleet. Second, they hoped they'd catch the Yankees celebrating, and they might get an advantage because of doing it on New Year's Eve. So at dusk on New Year's Eve, General McGruder is very near where the causeway leads to today. That's called Virginia Point, and he's going to lead his force across to the waterfront. The idea is they're going to get there at midnight, launch the attack at roughly midnight, coordinate with the cotton-clad gunboats coming from behind, and squeeze the Yankees out of the harbor with this sudden surprise attack. Well, the problem started materializing almost immediately. There was not really a bridge from the mainland to Galveston in those days. There was a railroad bridge, and they had planked over the railroad bridge to enable them to haul these big heavy guns across to the island. But the mules that were to pull these guns took one look at this planked over railroad bridge. No way they were going to go on that thing. And so precious time is lost pulling these guns by hand over the bridge to the island and getting them through some back alleys over to the area along the Strand where they were to be employed. And so instead of being midnight when this battle is supposed to start, they don't get to the Strand area until almost 5 a.m. And we know that really well because there was still a telegraph operating from Galveston to Houston. So the Battle of Galveston is one of the few battles of the Civil War that is the subject of essentially live news coverage. You can imagine what that was like, you know. General McGruder is now attacked, and now a word from our sponsor. Now, when I say they brought the guns along to the waterfront, I want to clarify what this is. Galveston was like a fish hook in those days. Its shape is different than it was today. And they put the guns all along the waterfront for about 2.5 miles. And there are more than 20 guns in this group of guns that's all along the waterfront. And the key position from the standpoint of the Confederates is at the very end of the island at what was called Fort Point. Just like the Battle of Gettysburg had a little round top, the position that everybody had to have strategically, well, the Confederates had to have this fort located on the tip of the Fort Point there, because from that fort, you could fire guns out here and keep the Union vessels from getting very close to shore. You could keep them at a distance. And that was the only thing that the Confederates had going in terms of strategic position. But when I say that they put guns all along the waterfront, they were not all at ground level. Some of the smaller pieces were taken up into the second and third floors of some of the big buildings on the Strand, and they will be fired out of the upper stories of that building during the Battle of Galveston. And it's hard to see in this particular drawing, but if you look very closely there, you can see the Henley building, which still stands there today with guns poking out of the upper stories. So at about 5 a.m., General McGruder will go to the area around the 20th and Strand area, and he will pull the lanyard to fire the first gun himself to signal the opening of the barrage. He pulls it and says, now boys, I've done my job as a private. It's time for me to go do my job as a general. And he hurries well away to the area around Broadway, which is where his headquarters is. Immediately, an immense bombardment starts from the shore all along the waterfront out at the Federal ships. The Federal ships waste no time in returning this fire, and Galveston is involved in a very serious and very heavy firefight. And it's still before dawn, but the Union gunners are quickly figuring out where the Confederate gun positions are, and they have much bigger guns to return fire with. But the idea, again, is that they're going to keep the Union ships occupied while the Confederate gunboats come from the rear. If you go to the Strand area today, if you go to 20th and Strand and walk to the 7th column from the end, you can still see damage from the Battle of Galveston. And we think that that damage was from the USS Owasco, which steamed along close enough to the area to really do some damage to the buildings on the Strand. Mr. George Mitchell has recently bought this building, by the way, and is in the process of restoring it. And I begged him not to fix the one column that was broken. He assured me he would not. So we'll look forward to that. All right, now we've talked about this bombardment from the shore. What about those poor Massachusetts troops at the end of that wharf? Well, what's going on out at the end of the wharf is those men are just laying there very quietly, and they're waiting for the Union Navy to rescue them. But the Navy doesn't rescue them, and they're facing fire from behind them, from in front of them, and even the Confederates wheel a small gun down to the end of the wharf next to them, and they're firing in from the wharf next to them, too. So they're really having a bad time of it. And you know what makes it worse? There's the 3 companies of this Massachusetts regiment. Only one of these 3 companies had arrived in Galveston with ammunition that was suitable for their weapons. So 2/3 of them have really no ammunition whatsoever to return to fire. Well, they wait around, and they're in a world of hurt. And then something happens that makes things really worse, because General McGruder knows that the men are at the end of the wharf, but he has a plan to take care of it. The idea is that at his signal, about 500 men under Colonel Joseph Cook are going to wade out on either side of this wharf, and they're carrying large ladders. And when they get to the end of the wharf, they're going to put the ladders up against the wharf, mount to the top of the wharf, and attack the Massachusetts troops from the rear. McGruder had seen this work in the Mexico campaign. He'd seen it work, and he thought it would work again. The only problem was when they got to the end of the wharf, put the ladders down, they sunk really, really deep into the ooze in Galveston, and the men could not reach the top of the wharf. So as a result, they throw down these ladders in disgust, return to the shore, and the only wading charge of the Civil War turns out to be a complete disaster. You know, it's now getting toward dawn, and things are not looking good. In fact, over at the General's headquarters on Broadway, the recordings say that every man's countenance was as long as a hoe handle. Well, what turns around the battle is that the arrival of the cotton clads happens. These gunboats come from the rear and finally do what they're supposed to do. Actually, these ships had arrived in sight of the enemy fleet at the time they were supposed to, but you remember General McGruder is delayed getting to the waterfront. And when they don't hear the gun that's to signal the attack, Leon Smith takes his men and they retreat farther up Galveston Bay to avoid tipping off the enemy. And they actually go a little bit farther up than they expected because it's very hazy on that early morning. When they hear McGruder launch the barrage that's to signal the attack, Leon Smith has all the steam that could be put on and those steamboats put on, and they head down as fast as they can toward the fleet at Galveston. But they're carrying all those cotton bales. They're carrying all those men. They're actually carrying some small guns on them. The Bayou City has a 32-pounder cannon in the front of it. The Neptune has a couple of howitzers in the front of it. So they're very slow in getting down to the area where the Federal fleet is. As they approach the Federal fleet, the Bayou City actually has a gun crew on it, and in charge of that gun crew is Captain Armand Weir. And Captain Weir starts firing his gun at the Federal ships. And about the 3rd or 4th time, he's preparing to fire. He's finally getting the range down. One of the spectators leans over the cotton bales down to Weir, who's in the bow, and he says, "Captain Weir, give him a New Year's Day present for me." And Weir says, "All right, here goes your New Year's Day present," and pulls the lanyard, at which point the gun in the Bayou City explodes, killing Weir and his entire Confederate gun crew. And so now the cotton clads are down to Plan B. And plan B is that they're going to ram one of the federal ships and send those sharpshooters across as a boarding party. And as Leon Smith is making his way down the bay, one of these young horse Marines turns to him and says, Major, he says, these cotton bales, they'll provide good protection against these federal ships and what they've got, won't they? And Leon Smith kind of sneers at the young man. He says, no, they will provide no protection whatsoever. Our only chance is to get alongside them and ram them. And the man has a very horrified look on his face as he realizes what the real plan is to be. The idea is they're going to encounter the first ship they encounter, which is by far the best ship in Galveston Harbor that day, the USS Harriet Lane. And the Neptune and the Bayou City, the two Confederate cotton clads, are going to try to ram it from opposite sides. And these steamers are side wheel steamers. They have a paddle wheel on each side. And the idea is they're going to put the bow up through the paddle wheel, disabling the federal ship, send over a boarding party, and try to capture the Harriet Lane. So the Bayou City takes dead aim on the Harriet Lane. They just make a grazing collision with it. It does more damage to the Bayou City, the Harriet Lane, and the Bayou City drifts by. The Neptune takes dead aim, and they don't hit the paddle wheel, but they hit the side of the Harriet Lane with a very satisfying crunch. Unfortunately, that crunch is the bow of the Confederate Neptune coming in, and so the captain of the Neptune has to just direct the Neptune off to a little shallow piece of water, and he sinks. And from that, they continue firing from their sunken ship as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the Bayou City turns around, rams the Harriet Lane, sends over a boarding party, and just like that, the Harriet Lane is in Confederate hands. And here's a drawing by an eyewitness showing the Bayou City ramming the Harriet Lane. Here is a brand new painting of the boarding of the Harriet Lane by noted Marine artist Patrick O'Brien, showing the Bayou City coming and the Harriet Lane. Again, this is right before dawn. Now, we haven't talked about Commander Renshaw at all. And the reason is, while all this is going on, wading charges, bombardments, all of the ramming attempts, all this is going on, his steamer, the Westfield, has run aground in the distance and is not part of the battle at all. And as dawn comes and he sees the Harriet Lane now bearing a Confederate flag, Commodore Renshaw decides that there's nothing to it. He's just got to blow up the Westfield, his flagship, just to keep it out of Confederate hands. They lay the charge to blow up the Westfield, and as it explodes, unfortunately it's premature, and so Commander Renshaw and all the men in his boat, about 13 men, are killed. And so the Westfield is now completely blown up. Commander Renshaw is blown up, and what is left of the Union force in Galveston Harbor will then leave. But that's not quite the end of the story of the Westfield. I thought you would be interested in this as something fairly new. In the fall of 2009, the Corps of Engineers decided to expand the Texas City Channel. In doing so, a group of archaeologists here in Austin actually rediscovered the wreck of the Harriet Lane, and I was a project historian on the project where we excavated the wreck of the Harriet Lane, and one of my main contributions was to find this very rare drawing in the Memphis Public Library of the Westfield done a week before it blew up in Galveston Bay. And if you look at that gun where the arrow is, that's this gun. It's a 9-inch Dahlgren cannon. We brought it up and took it to Conservation Research Laboratory at Texas A&M, where it's in the process of conservation, and it will be in the Texas City Museum here in the next year. This is it. After it's cleaned off a little bit, you can see what the gun looks like. It's huge, huge, really a beautiful thing. There are tons of artifacts, including a lot of really neat things. I thought you'd find this interesting. These are called ironclads because they do have iron armor on the side. And here is a 5-foot by 5-foot piece of that armor that was brought up. And here to give you an idea of what it looked like. This is 5/8-inch thick boiler steel, and this is called boilerplate. And this was the armor that was on the sides of these gunboats. And you hear the expression boilerplate applied to contracts and pieces of contracts that really don't have a whole lot of meaning, but they're there anyway. Well, that's the way this armor was. It would not stop any serious projectile, but it probably would stop musket fire. But we're just developing the story of the Westfield from this archaeology. How do you regard the Battle of Galveston? Well, again, it depends on which side you are. Jefferson Davis thought it was the most brilliant exploit of the war. Admiral David Glasgow Farragut called it the most shameful incident in the entire history of the United States Navy. One last story to tell is about the story of Edward Lee. The first officer on board the Harriet Lane was a man named Edward Lee, L-E-A. Now, what he did not know was that his father, Albert Lee, was serving on General McGruder's staff. So this is a case where literally the father and son were serving on opposite sides of the battle. At the end of the battle, General McGruder allowed Albert Lee to go over to the waterfront to look for his boy. He was rowed out to the Harriet Lane and found his son Edward mortally wounded on the deck. Albert Lee went away to get some medical attention for his son, but there was nothing for it. The young man was too far gone. As he was waiting to die, he kept telling the surgeons over and over and over, my father is here, my father is here. So the next day they held a funeral, a joint funeral for him and his commanding officer, a man named Jonathan Wainwright. They laid the two men in the same grave in the Trinity Episcopal Cemetery in a service that was conducted by the father, Albert Lee, and witnessed both by the Confederates in the area and the Union prisoners, all at that one cemetery. The monument that was put up later for the young man is this one right here. It's very simple, but it says down at the bottom, my father is here, the young man's last words. So General McGruder, after the war, would go to Mexico. This would be the last major battle that he would conduct. He would die in Houston in 1871, but the people of Galveston never forgot General McGruder. And so they would eventually bring him back to Galveston and bury him under this impressive monument in Trinity Episcopal Cemetery, not far from the grave of young Edward Lee. The Battle of Galveston would start what would turn out to be the worst year of the war for the Union in Texas. 10 days following the Battle of Galveston, the CSS Alabama shows up about 20 miles off of Galveston and encounters and sinks the USS Hatteras in a battle that you all may have read about something this week. We're doing sonar imaging of that wreck to do a 3D model of it. About on the 21st of that same month, the Confederates will come out of Sabine Pass and capture the blockaders USS Morning Light and Velocity, followed by the almost miraculous battle in September of 1863 when they win the Battle of Sabine Pass. Texas will get to the point where every dispatch that comes out from here uses the word disaster. And really one of the people in Washington at military headquarters said that whenever a dispatch came in from Texas, they didn't even need to read the contents. They just knew that it was going to have the word disaster very, very heavy up in it. And Admiral Farragut actually wrote that he says, I have nothing but disaster to report from Texas. So it would be a very dramatic battle to start the year of 1863, but certainly one of the most unique battles of the entire Civil War. Thank you very much.
We do have time for questions. Please wait for a microphone if you have one, please, so we can get it on videotape. Questions, please.
I find the idea of cotton clads as being rather strange, considering how flammable cotton is.
Yeah, but when it's packed that densely, when the cotton is packed that densely, it's not as flammable as you might think it is. In fact, I didn't really go into this, but over on the near the railroad station, General McGruder had actually brought over a railroad car that he had armored with cotton bales around a large naval gun, and they fired that out at the harbor. They were using that for protection. It was a cotton-clad gun. Now, if you think about it, here's a mobile, armored, maneuverable gun. What is he experimenting with? The tank. And this is only the second time in military history that a rail-mounted military gun has been used. And by the end of the war in Galveston, the Confederates are experimenting with a railroad car that is armored literally with iron armor on the outside and a turret gun in the top of it. So they're really getting close to the tank model. And General McGruder will authorize the building of 2 submarines in Galveston. And we have a record of one of them actually operational, and one of them has never been accounted for, and that's something I'd hope to see sometime.
you mentioned that the artifacts, the cannon and other artifacts were being conserved. Will they be displayed eventually?
Most of them will be. Some of these things are just such small, weird things that you can't really even put a name on them, but a lot of these will be. There are going to probably be some in Galveston at the Rosenberg Library, the Naval Museum. There'll be the big cannon will go to Texas City along with most of the boiler machinery. Some of the artifacts, I hope, will come here to the Bullock Museum and be displayed, because some of this stuff is so unusual that it really is the only example we have of this. The Westfield is a Staten Island ferry boat that was converted into a gunboat. So they were very, very unusual warships. But it had been at the Battle of New Orleans, it had been at the Battle at Vicksburg, it had been all up and down the Texas coast, Louisiana coast of the Mississippi River. Saw an incredible amount of action. So this is this was the most historic Civil War wreck in Texas waters, and we're really lucky that we were able to find it, raise it.
The best ship in the theater there just took more to it than that, I think.
Well, what's funny about it, again, these steamboats have fairly high decks, and what they thought would happen is they'd put, like boarding planks that would come from these steamboats onto the docks to roll barrels up and stuff. They'd taken these to the upper decks, and they'd set them upright, and they'd put anchors on them on the outer side, leading out like this, so that when they could cut a rope, these things would just go over like that onto the enemy ship and they could rush across. But they hadn't really counted on the size of the Harriet Lane and how hard it would be to deploy something like that as they were moving. So in the first boarding attempt, when they're going across by the Harriet Lane, they cut the rope prematurely, and this ramp goes down, and all it does is it hits the Harriet Lane and breaks off the boarding ramp and does significant damage to the Confederate Bayou City as they've done this going by. So on the second attempt, they just hit bow on, and they are able to go over the net that's used to repel boarders. On the Union ship, they just crawl over that net, and they're onto the Union ship with no trouble at all, and within, the estimates are in less than a minute, they had control of the entire deck. Because they had 150 sharpshooters, some of whom had infield rifles, some of whom had shotguns, and they had really dispatched virtually every officer on the deck of the Harriet Lane.
Nothing else? Well then.
You mentioned that McGruder went to serve under Maximilian. What was that all about?
A lot of the Confederate officers went south just to avoid. They didn't know what fate awaited them, and they were really worried about that. And particularly the men down here in the Trans-Mississippi, Edmund Kirby Smith and McGruder, men like that went down to Mexico just to wait until the coast was clear to come back. They'd seen Jefferson Davis arrested. There was a lot of talk about Davis being tried for war crimes, and they had waited a long time to surrender. The Union was not really happy with them, and so McGruder went down there, but he didn't really serve in a military capacity down there. It was more of an administrative capacity. He came back to the United States. He was relatively poor. He didn't really have anything to do. Soldiering was all he really knew to do. So he went around the United States lecturing and kind of showing a magic lantern show about his exploits, but he didn't do very well once he came back.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Cotham.